In 2000, when I was 14, a new boy named Augusto joined our school. He was just an ordinary kid, but he was very short and thin. I started making fun of his appearance and encouraged my friends to do the same. Things got worse when rumors began circulating that his grandfather, who he lived with, practiced witchcraft and other strange things I still don't fully understand. Back then, I was completely ignorant about such matters. So I joined in mocking him, calling him names and teasing him whenever I could. I'm not sure how he endured it for so many months. I guess it was because I never physically hurt him. It was mostly insults or the occasional shove in the school hallway. This dynamic changed one day when he finally stood up to me. As we were leaving school, he pushed me back and a fight broke out. I knew how to box, so I was confident, and in my arrogance, I didn't hesitate to give him a black eye. No teachers were around to intervene, and I didn't care when I saw him lying on the ground afterward. He seemed fine, just a black eye and a slightly swollen, cut lip. I left with my friends, thinking that was the end of it and things would go back to normal. But that same afternoon, someone came to my house. Apparently, Augusto's grandfather was furious about what I had done to his grandson. To give you some context, my father was never a great role model. He was even more arrogant than I was. And when the old man demanded that I apologize, my father refused. He claimed it was just boys being boys, and that Augusto should man up and defend himself instead of hiding behind his grandfather. Even back then, I felt my father was being unnecessarily harsh, but I didn't say anything. Instead, I stood by him, mocking Augusto and calling him a coward. We spent a good amount of time insulting the old man and telling him to leave our property. The grandfather didn't take it well. When my father made it clear I wouldn't apologize, his anger turned to fury. He glared at my father, perhaps disapproving of how he was raising me, and then muttered something in a language I didn't understand. He spat on the ground and left with Augusto. My father brushed off the incident and didn't even scold me for giving the boy a black eye. He never cared much about those things. That same night I had a strange dream. I saw the old man standing in a long, dark hallway staring at me. No matter how much I walked, I couldn't move forward. Suddenly I felt a crushing pressure in my chest, as if my heart was about to explode. The old man watched me with the same hatred he had shown my father earlier that day. The pain was unbearable, and I woke up sweating, trembling, and gasping for air. It felt so real, but I convinced myself it was just a nightmare and went back to sleep. The next day at school, Augusto seemed irritated with me. I was about to tease him again, but something stopped me. A fear similar to what I had felt in the dream. I ignored him and avoided him the rest of the day, even when my friends suggested we bother him. Every time I got close, I felt that same pressure in my chest, which scared me. I tried to act normal, convincing my friends that teasing him wasn't fun anymore and that the teachers might notice his black eye. A couple of nights later, I was walking home late after playing basketball with friends. I was alone listening to music when I heard heavy breathing, like a panting dog. I looked around but saw nothing. The streets were empty, which made me nervous. I quickened my pace, hoping to see someone else, but no one was around. The breathing grew louder, as if something was closing in on me. Then I heard footsteps like a dog running toward me. When I turned, I saw a huge black dog. What shocked me wasn't its size, or the fact that it was charging at me. It was that its front paws looked almost human, with long fingers. Its snout was oddly short, too. I started running, but the dog never caught up, as if it was toying with me. I eventually bumped into someone who seemed confused by my panic. They said there was no dog, but I was sure I had seen and heard it. That encounter marked the beginning of what I call the bad days. Everything started going wrong. My father, who had always been healthy, began to deteriorate. He developed bruises, fatigue, and insomnia. His hair started falling out and his teeth decayed. Doctors couldn't explain it. All his tests came back normal. Meanwhile, I started noticing strange marks on my body, like handprints from someone with enormous hands. They didn't hurt, but they burned, as if hot metal had been pressed against my skin. I kept it to myself, not wanting to add to my father's problems. Our house also began to smell awful, and sometimes I'd see something dripping down the walls. We had people check it out, but they found nothing wrong. My father eventually lost his job, and we struggled financially. No matter how much money came in, it seemed to vanish. At school, my friends drifted away because I was always in a bad mood. One day, a classmate I rarely spoke to approached me. He said he'd been at Augusto's house and saw a room full of photos tied with black ribbon, some of which were of me. He also mentioned there was hair in the photos. He didn't stay long because Augusto's grandfather showed up, but he felt compelled to tell me, especially after seeing how much I'd changed. That night, my father called me to his room looking pale and unwell. He started vomiting hair, an endless amount. It was horrifying. He passed out and I called an ambulance. He died a few hours later from a heart attack. After his death, most of the strange occurrences stopped, but the marks on my body and the nightmares remained. I'm convinced Augusto's grandfather had something to do with all of it, but I have no way to prove it. Like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let's continue to the next story. I started listening to the stories on this channel not too long ago because, before what happened to me, I used to think hauntings and supernatural stuff were nonsense. I believed they were just tales to scare kids. Ironically, here I am now, sharing something that changed my life forever. I never learned to read or write because my family was very poor. When I tried going to school, the other kids mocked me, calling me stupid and dirty. I told my father how much it hurt and he let me stop going. I stayed home helping with chores and tending to the garden we had on the neighboring property. Before I begin my story, I want to thank my friend Gilberto for writing this down for me. He's the one who sent it to you all. Since I didn't go to school and spent most of my time at home bored, my father eventually took me to work with him. That's how I learned about plumbing, gardening, and construction. I also worked as a street sweeper. I did whatever job I could find to put food on the table. I never felt ashamed of these jobs, because even though educated people often don't value them, they still end up needing them at some point. One day we were hired to take care of the garden for a very wealthy family. I thought they were the kind of people who wanted everything perfect in life and didn't know how to spend their money. My father and I worked for them for 15 years, until he passed away. During that time I noticed some things, like how the man of the house had another family and didn't get along with his wife, who spent most of her time away with friends. They didn't have children, so they spent all their money on themselves. After my father died, I took over the garden and some repairs around the house. It would have been a good job, but one afternoon things changed. The man, whom I'll call Fernando, asked me to come inside for a drink. I felt awkward because my hands were dirty from the soil and I smelled like sweat. I apologized, but he just laughed and said, "If you've been tending the garden for so many years, you should consider yourself part of the family." I didn't know what he wanted, but extra money sounded good. After asking about my family, he offered me a chance to earn more. I asked if it was illegal, and even if it had been, I probably would have agreed. But he said no. He wanted me to be his personal driver. He needed someone he could trust completely. At first I thought it was about his affairs, which didn't bother me. They were his problems, not mine. Before accepting, I asked how much he'd pay, and my eyes probably lit up like a cartoon character. Only a fool would have refused. I agreed and started the next day. Over the next year, I got used to driving Fernando around, buying expensive things, visiting beautiful, wealthy women, and handling some of his business. It was a comfortable life, but one night while driving, Fernando asked me, "Wouldn't you like to become a member?" I asked, "A member of what?" He smiled and said, "You've probably guessed what happens at those parties. There are two things you need to know. First, if you're smart, you can earn as much money as you want and buy everything you've ever dreamed of. Second, all you have to do is worship, please, and give him what he asks for. Also, you can never miss a meeting because what comes easy goes easy." To be honest, I didn't care much about the details. I had a wife and child who depended on me, and this was my chance to give them a better life. We weren't extremely poor, but I couldn't give them the luxuries they deserved. Plus, I was curious about what really went on at those parties. I imagined it was money laundering or something illegal, but nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that night. When we arrived at the party, Fernando introduced me to two older men who seemed to be in charge. They looked me up and down, skeptical because of my humble appearance, but eventually let me pass. Inside, there were chairs arranged in a circle and a large bed in the center. As people took their seats, drums began to play, a strange, almost African-sounding music. Then a young woman appeared from a door behind the chairs. She had peacock feathers in her hair and was completely naked. Her long brown hair caught my attention, but no one else seemed to notice her. She lay down on the bed and closed her eyes. Then 6 young men who looked like models from a magazine appeared. One by one, they had relations with her. When the 6th one finished, she pulled a knife from under the covers and slit his throat. I wanted to scream, but I was frozen in shock. The woman then did the same to herself. The people in the chairs stood up and applauded. The room was dimly lit except for the bed, which was brightly illuminated. Then the lights above us turned on, and I saw a figure. I think it was a person, but I'm not sure. It had bull horns on its head, was naked and wore a mask. Its hands were raised to the ceiling, and its feet looked like hooves, though I couldn't see clearly. When it lowered its hands, The people around me began making strange noises, some like they were vomiting, others screaming and making grotesque gestures. I was terrified, thinking something might happen to me. I realized this was some kind of cult sacrifice. Fernando was beside me, also undressing and joining in. Everyone else did the same, and I felt I had no choice but to follow. The ritual lasted until around 5 a.m. The two bodies remained on the bed the entire time. When it was over, we dressed and left. Fernando seemed pleased and asked if I enjoyed it. I lied and said yes. He then told me I was now a member and needed to bring someone, a young boy, to the next meeting. He said this was how the world worked. My hands shook as I drove home. I promised to bring my 18-year-old nephew, but I had no intention of doing so. When I got home, I broke down crying. I couldn't tell my wife everything, but I confessed enough to make her understand we needed to leave. We packed our things and moved far away. It's been a year and a half, and I still live in fear that someone from that group might find me. I often dream of that horned figure watching us from above. I feel like a shell of the man I used to be. I can't talk about this with anyone because I don't want to change how they see me, and I'm still terrified of what might happen if I do. Before I end, I want to warn everyone, don't get involved with these kinds of groups. It's not worth it. My name is Emily, and when I was 25, I took a solo trip to Rio de Janeiro. My favorite DJ was performing there that weekend, and I had always wanted to visit the city. I've traveled alone many times before and never had any issues. The Airbnb I chose was affordable, located a bit outside the city, and was really nice. A small, modern, and clean one-story house. On the Friday I arrived, I unpacked, had dinner, and headed to the venue where the DJ was playing, which was on a rooftop terrace. The first day and night went smoothly, and I met some cool people there, including James, Ian, and Marcelo, a couple who were also visiting the city. The next day we met up again for brunch and spent the day exploring tourist spots like Christ the Redeemer and Sugarloaf Mountain, followed by some beach time. Unfortunately, they already had tickets to another show that night, which I didn't, so I decided to explore the city on my own. It was fine. I found plenty to do. When I got hungry, I started heading back to my Airbnb, which was on the outskirts of the city. On the way, I stopped at a restaurant I came across. I know a little Portuguese, but am not fluent, so I tried to stick to places where people seemed to speak English, especially since I was alone. The menu in the window had some English words, so I went in. The restaurant was small and dimly lit. Many places in the area were expensive, but this one seemed affordable. The dining area was long and narrow, and it wasn't very crowded. Few people were sitting at tables toward the back. There was also a man sitting almost right next to me, probably in his 50s, and I wondered if he was a tourist too. He and I were the only ones sitting alone. The waiter came over and spoke in Portuguese, so I asked if he spoke English. He said yes, and from then on I ordered in English. I noticed the man at the other table kept staring at me while I ordered, which felt weird. When the waiter left, the man commented in English with a Portuguese accent that my Portuguese sounded good. I thanked him, and he started talking to me in Portuguese, almost like he was giving me a lesson. So I think he thought he was being charming, but it was annoying. I kept looking at my phone to seem distracted, but he wouldn't stop talking to me in both English and Portuguese. To be polite and avoid an awkward situation, I tried to respond and converse in Portuguese while he corrected my mistakes. The conversation was mostly about where I was from, what I was doing in Rio, what I'd done that day, and where I was staying. I lied and said I was staying with a friend. What really made me uncomfortable was when he said I sounded sexy speaking Portuguese. I hoped he'd leave soon, but I lost hope when I saw the waiter bringing his food. Thankfully, my dish didn't take long to arrive. I ordered a pork stew, and the man asked if it was good. I said yes, and thankfully he stopped talking as much once he started eating. I ate quickly and asked for the bill as soon as I was done, just to end the conversation. The man also asked for his bill right after me, which I found strange since he hadn't even finished his meal. As soon as I paid, I got up and left. He said something in Portuguese, but I just said goodbye and kept walking. It was already dark, and the streets were less crowded. I walked for a while until I reached a crosswalk. While waiting to cross, I noticed the man from the restaurant on the other side of the street. He was definitely looking at me, but glanced away when I noticed. Maybe he was going the same way. It wasn't impossible. I kept walking, and as I got closer to the Airbnb, I turned around a few times to see if he was still there. When I finally reached the house, I looked around one last time and saw him standing at the end of the street, staring in my direction. My heart raced. He had followed me. I rushed inside, locked the door, and closed all the curtains. Now he knew where I was staying. I panicked and called my dad. He told me to stay alert, make sure everything was locked, and maybe even keep a knife nearby. It was Saturday night, and my flight wasn't until the next evening, so I still wanted to go out. I called an Uber to a bar downtown and went to an electronic music event. I stayed there for a few hours before calling another Uber to go back. When I got home, I was a bit drunk and plopped onto the couch to rest. That's when I noticed something. I heard a wind-like noise and saw the kitchen curtains swaying. The kitchen window was open, but I had closed all the windows because of the air conditioning. At that moment, I knew I had to get out of there fast. I called the police and tried to explain as best as I could that there had been a break-in. The officers arrived within minutes, and I came out of my hiding spot behind a bush when I saw the patrol car. One of the officers spoke a little English, so I explained that the window had been opened and that I had been followed. They went inside the house and started shouting words I didn't understand. When they came out with that man in handcuffs, it was the most shocking moment of my life. If I had gone into the bedroom, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. Thankfully, he was dumb enough not to close the window after breaking in. I left the next day and have visited Brazil once since then. This happened a few months ago. I've been driving for Uber for a few years now, and I usually work the late night shifts. The streets are quieter and the tips are better, but there's a price to pay. Every now and then you end up with a story that sticks with you, and not in a good way. I've always considered myself a cautious person. I've dealt with my fair share of strange passengers, but nothing, absolutely nothing, came close to being as bizarre as what I'm about to tell you. At the time I didn't have a dash cam, and that night was the main reason I installed one. It all started normally, just me and the occasional weird noises my car makes. I drive a beat-up 2005 Volvo, but it's incredibly reliable. The streets were completely empty, which, as I mentioned before, is how I like it. Around 2 a.m., I got a ride request from a nearby convenience store. It seemed harmless at first, but for some reason, I felt a strange knot in my stomach. You know that feeling when something feels off, but you can't quite explain why? That's what hit me as I drove there. Before I even saw the guy, I understood why I had that gut feeling. The convenience store I was heading to was closed. All the lights were off, and there wasn't a single car in the parking lot. As I got closer, I saw him. I made sure to drive slowly to get a good look. He was pacing back and forth in front of the store, wearing a filthy hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. I'm not exaggerating. His movements were jittery, like he couldn't stay still, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if he thought someone was following him. If I had to guess, I'd say he was under the influence of something. I probably should have cancelled the ride and left. I even hovered my finger over the cancel button, but for some reason I didn't. I unlocked the doors, and he got in the back seat without saying a word. The moment I took my foot off the brake, I regretted my decision. Most people either fiddle with their phones or look out the window, but not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror without blinking or looking away. I tried to avoid making eye contact, but I ended up locking eyes with him a few times. He seemed kind of irritated, which only made everything more uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember which station I chose, but the moment the music started playing, he yelled at me to turn it off. His voice was deep, and I immediately noticed he was a smoker. It caught me off guard, and I accidentally jerked the wheel a little. I resisted the urge to look at him in the mirror and just obeyed, gripping the wheel tighter. We sat in silence for a while, and I honestly hoped he'd stay quiet until we reached the destination. But then he spoke, and I remember that conversation like it was yesterday. He asked me if I'd ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. That question hit me like a brick. I let out a nervous laugh and said, "Well, I guess not." I tried to keep my tone light, but he didn't react. He just leaned back and muttered something to himself that I couldn't understand. Then he started talking about how he used to be an Uber driver but quit because some kids stole his car. He was rambling, so I couldn't catch everything, but I got the gist of it. I glanced at the rearview mirror a couple of times while he was talking and noticed he was smiling the whole time, which was extremely unsettling. A normal person wouldn't smile while telling a story like that. He ended his story by saying, "It's funny how much you can trust someone sitting right behind you." That sentence changed how I saw him. I started viewing him more as a threat than just some random drugged-up guy. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. My heart was pounding, but I kept my eyes on the road. My mind was racing. I quickly glanced at the GPS, clinging to the destination like it was my lifeline. But the guy just didn't know when to stop talking. He kept rambling about random things. Some of it concerning, some of it just nonsense. I honestly couldn't keep up. At one point, He started apologizing to someone, though I didn't think it was directed at me. He began hinting that he'd done something terrible and that he was a bad person. He kept repeating, "I didn't mean to," followed by multiple, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond, afraid he might react aggressively if I said anything. I had no idea what he'd done or what he was capable of, but I didn't want to find out. We were a few minutes away from the destination when he snapped out of his trance and shouted at me, saying I'd missed the turn. I hadn't. The GPS clearly showed we were on the right path, but out of sheer fear, I hit the brakes. He demanded I stop the car, and that's exactly what I did. My hands were shaking at that point, and I just wanted the nightmare to be over. As soon as I put the car in neutral, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I said a silent prayer and watched as it slowly approached, its spotlight briefly illuminating my car. The guy in the back immediately ducked down, trying not to be seen. I glanced over and saw him lying almost completely flat on the back seat, with his eyes closed. I quickly turned my head back before he noticed. He stayed in that position for an uncomfortably long time. I wanted to tell him to get out, but I thought it was better not to risk it. Eventually, he lifted his head and told me I was lucky. Before I could do anything, he opened the door and disappeared. After that, I ended my shift early. I was shaken and didn't want to drive anymore that night. A few weeks later, I found something on my phone that proved just how dangerous that situation had been. According to a news article, a convenience store clerk had been killed that same night, just 2 blocks from where I picked up that guy. It made me sick to think I was inches away from a dangerous criminal who could have hurt me if he wanted to. I'm a little scared to report this to the police. I avoid contact with authorities for personal reasons I'd rather not get into, and I don't even know if my account would help. Either way, I'm much more cautious now about who I let into my car. And those were today's accounts. Like, if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. I'll bring more stories every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. See you in the next video.